Hi, my name is Rufus. Welcome to my podcast, and today I will talk about an article written by Gerard Bahage. The article is called Rap, Reggae, Rock or Samba, the Local and the Global in Brazilian Popular Music from the decade of 1985 to 1995. Now, this decade was a very significant time as it marks the first decade of freedom of speech and expression in Brazil, as it just came out of a very long and hard dictatorship. However, there were still many problems, with racism, poverty, and police brutality still being very prominent. He begins by talking generally about the world's situation with globalization and the homogenizing of music. He talks also about the Western impact on culture's music, saying, "We cannot meaningfully talk about the music of a West African village without taking into consideration of the corporate strategies of the US." And he's sort of talking about the commercialization and in big industries and genres being taken over, and maybe a bit of loss of originality and maybe a loss of that impact of music culture. Then he talks about, of course, the main topic of the Brazilian music and the social fragmentation and divide. I wasn't very aware of the situation, but this article gave me a great insight into the music expressions and diversities. I found it very interesting also. He discusses the origins of bossa nova and tropicalia in the 60s and the importance it had in resisting the regime and hidden meanings in harmonies and melodies and how they used that to spread their voice. Music in these times sort of talked about grief, brutality, social, political issues, racism, and murder. This music was really powerful, like the song Haiti and Construxal in the 60s. There was a restriction of freedom of speech, and the times were really hard, with lots of people being imprisoned and murdered if they spoke out. The development in the 80s were in very unexpected ways. Local adaptations of international styles and different regional cultures and sounds of popular music was segmented in Brazil with different social structures and political consciousness. He analyzes these different genres and identities of music in Brazil, and his research, he went to many different regions, from Sao Paulo to Bahia and Rio, conducted interviews with the big corporations and the small corporations, as well as lots of individuals. So it's safe to say he has a very broad perspective on this topic. His analysis on samba, he then talks about. Samba was a strong genre associated with Brazil. He talks about Afro-Brazilians' roles in inventing the samba whilst facing great oppression, and many different ethnic groups and classes also. So it was very unifying, and samba was also used as resistance strongly in the 60s and 70s also, as I talked about before. But in the 80s it was more commercialized and very much less political, as it transferred to like national music identity, unifying the country. It became a lot more globalized and a lot less political and safer package. But this left space for other genres to fill this gap on talking out in the 80s. He talks about two artists, Bareke and Veloso, and their different styles, one being more heavily based in the local and the music of Bach, whilst Veloso having a much more global approach. He says music is seen as a mixture of mixtures, sort of talking about a blend of different musical styles where they're taking from other styles around the world and making it very much their own. Gilberto Gil, he dives into many musical styles, and he dived heavily into his Bahamian roots during this period, closely associating himself with the black movement. He delved into many musical trends as well, such as disco, reggae, soul, funk, rock, and even punk. He was very influential and a great artist of this decade. Next, he talks about rock in Brazil, which was a very much new thing that exploded on the scene around 81, and it was named Rock Brasileiro, taking influence from the global, but very much still being that strong Brazilian identity. The rock seemed more middle class. Bahagi states that the movement was a reflection of the youth who had grown up under the regime. And it had a lot more resources than some other movements, such as rap, but it took off and was very popular. Example like Blitz, song Você Não Sabe Meu Amor, sold 800,000 copies in a very short time. And certain types of groups of youth emerged as fans that faced a little bit of criticism and saw themselves as sort of punks. Lyrics in the 90s in the rock had both global and local issues, and he describes it as being a sort of hybrid, but it was not as political as, say, rap, which he goes on to talk about it. This was very political, coming from the favelas. It had poor origins, and it addressed directly the problems, and it didn't shy away from it. It demanded change. It talks about problems of police violence, poverty, racism, and life in the favelas. And unlike the other genres, it was a lot less mainstream. It was deeply local and tied to community activism. For many young people, rap wasn't just music, it was a form of survival, protest, and education, and it gave a voice to those that weren't being heard. In the end, Bahagi says that Brazilian music during this time was shaped by a mix of global influence and local struggle. The musicians didn't just copy the style, they were using it in their own ways and really to speak to their own realities. And some genres became more commercial and mainstream, like maybe samba and rock, while others, like reggae and rap, stayed more connected to the political and cultural resistance. Other genres also he talked about was reggae, which grew from the state of Bahia. Reggae was really important, and it combined often salsa and other Brazilian traditional rhythms. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for listening. Bye.